Chapter 13. It was hard to imagine what could be worse, but Prudence had a feeling that worse was still incoming. And then, as if the worst weren't bad enough, another oil lamp went out inside the Fresnel. The lamp's light dimmed some more and the airship nudged closer, angling so that a ramp, one half wood and half fog, could be lowered to rest in the place where the railing had broken. The brimstone smell intensified, but so did the cold. And then the screaming cut off, as if someone had flipped a switch. She felt pinned in place by Lord Henry's creepy human eyes and his dragon head cane. Off to the left, her grandfather's specter turned to face them, his burning gaze both entreating and filled with warning. Not that she needed the warning. The urge to flee was so strong, it took all her focus to keep the portal at bay. Her gear showed a strong connection to Octavius. Ernest gripped her hand. Emergency transit might save them if her gear was accurate. Had her grandfather faced this horror, he would have followed protocol and tried to transit. Only here he was, caught like the fly in the creepy web. So that seemed to rule out an emergency transit, which meant she probably couldn't trust the readings. They might be as messed up as Ernest's instruments. Was it possible to craft a dimensional transit trap? She glanced at Lord Henry, and caught him licking his creepy thin lips in anticipation. He loved what was happening. Couldn't wait for what he thought she'd do. The analogy of the fly and the spider kept rising in a brain almost frozen with panic. But not quite. Flight or fight? If flight was out and fighting was indicated, how did one fight specters? Ghosts? A life force collecting master. The boom of footsteps against ghostly wood yanked her attention back to the ghost ship. Amidst the drifting fog or mist, she thought she saw a figure. Slowly it emerged from the mist, stopping at the top of the gangplank. Ernest inhaled sharply. Prudence more slowly, because her chest was so tight breathing was only barely possible. It was a specter-distorted mirror of Lord Henry. All she could say about him was that he made the human Lord Henry look good. All that was hideous about the man was worse in the specter. And his skeleton was visible through a surface as transparent as his ship. The clothes were tattered and floated around him like the fog clinging to the ship. He didn't doff his ragged top hat. Apparently, manners weren't as important after spectrifying. He leaned on a cane that was a complete twin of the one held by the human Lord Henry. It sparked when the tip touched the gangplank. Through his fingers, red eyes glowed, from what she presumed was another dragon head. She'd never liked horror movies. If she managed to survive this, she'd be a lot less judgmental about what characters did while in them. She knew her thoughts were silly, random even. If she focused on stupid stuff, maybe she could keep from panicking. Because if she panicked, well, she had a feeling that is exactly what they wanted. A fly struggling in this terrifying web. She didn't know how she knew this, and technically she didn't know it, but it felt true. If the human-ish Lord Henry liked panic and pain, then how much more would his creepy counterpart be panting for it? Her gaze flicked back to her grandfather. To the chains that contained him. Why was he the only one in chains? Why no, the question wasn't why. It was obvious why he'd been caught and chained. He was an interdimensional agent. They were using him, the man with the most talent ever, to travel between dimensions. To move more than a few people, but a ship. Okay, it was a specter ship, but there was the storm. That's how it could move between dimensions, how it could appear and disappear. That's how he'd been able to play the Dr. Masterson card. Though it didn't explain why it was eating other dimensions, something to do with the life force it required, maybe? Her grandfather's specter looked less than the others. Had they sucked the life out of him, and were hoping she could take up the job? Did she have enough talent to move something that large between dimensions? She wasn't sure she knew how. The whys and hows didn't matter. They now had the only other agent as talented as her grandfather trapped, or almost trapped in their web. The distinction was small but necessary to keep her from having a hysterical fit. She glanced at the human-ish Lord Henry. Why two of them? Why Ernest? And Ophelia? What did he have? Lord Henry had funded the geologic expedition. While she'd been up in the lamp room trying to get her voice back, trying not to scream like a little girl, she'd heard him ask Ernest if something he'd picked up in his travels was causing the problems with his instruments. The only item that fit and was related to that contact was the meteorite. Did they want it? Or did they fear it? Or was it both? It collected and stored energy. Might a life force be an energy source too? Could they collect people's souls, their life force, with the meteorite? Or did they hope Ernest could do it for them? Was this trap for both of them? Lightning began to build around the ghost airship, emanating from the hull, or so it seemed, dancing across the sky and hitting the lightning rod at the top of the lighthouse. She studied the flashes and realized that just as she could see interdimensional lines in her head, there were connected lines in the seemingly random flashes. All of them leading from the lighthouse to the ship. Or from the ship to the lighthouse. It was hard to tell. But they were connected flashes, not disconnected flashes. It was doing something. She wished she knew what, because she had a feeling that it needed to be stopped. She had an idea. Or the ghost of one. Dr. Ernest Warren. The Specter's mouth opened, but the words seemed to come from the human Lord Henry. Ernest's grip on her hand tightened. Might have been painful if she'd had feeling left in it. But it was so cold, her breath was a blue mist hanging in the air in front of her. I am here, he finally said, his tone so calm she'd have been impressed if he wasn't smashing her fingers to pulp. What do you want? The red gaze fixed on Ernest, then traveled to Prudence. She lifted her chin, let defiance show in her eyes. She hoped. I want the witch. Which? Prudence's brows rose. She'd have been offended if she wasn't so busy being terrified. Ernest's mouth opened, but the Lord Henry Spectre held up a claw-like hand, the one holding the cane, and pointed the dragon head at Ophelia. Red light shot from it, circling her like rope and dragged her to the top of the ramp. Ernest, she cried. Help me. She writhed in its hold as if the rope hurt her. Hard to believe he could, but Ernest managed to stiffen some more next to her. Prudence managed to stiffen some too, as she sensed what was coming. Your true love, his voice was thick with derision, for the witch? Yeah, not a surprise. Your true love for the witch. The words echoed inside Ernest's head. For a moment his heart rebounded with joy at the thought, but reason quickly killed the hope. That could not be his Ophelia. And how could he hand Prudence over to that monstrous thing? How could he trade a lost life for a true life? It's a lie, he heard himself say. You lie. You can't resurrect the dead. It's not possible. Even as he said the words, he heard Prudence's voice in his head. 6 impossible things. I am proof it is possible, Lord Henry spoke next to him, using his voice, not that of the spectre. I am real. Living and breathing. I died, his red gaze flicked balefully toward Prudence as if he somehow held her responsible, and came back better than before. She will return, even better than your memory of her. You can have your love, return to your real life, and forget this ever happened. If you give us the witch. He probed his senses, hoping for something, some memory of what they'd done before to guide him now. But all he felt was horror. Horror at the thought of Prudence in the clutches of that thing. Horror for Ophelia, trapped there. How could he choose? But how to fight ghosts? Specters? Her weapon had destroyed the automaton dragon, and perhaps could kill Lord Henry, but if that thing could bring him back. Do it, Prudence said. He jerked, turned to stare at her. She looked at the spectre, not at him. Take the deal. No. The words were forcefully uttered, so forcefully it shocked him. The spectre next to Lord Henry was not his Ophelia, and she wasn't his true love. It was a bad time to realize she probably never had been. Oh, had she lived, he would have been faithful, but what he felt for her, he stopped the thought. He had to stop it. Because if he admitted it, if only to himself, then he'd have to take the deal. From guilt. Not because he loved Ophelia so much, but because he did not love her enough. Yes? She angled toward him, her smile beyond strained. Her eyes were bruised circles in her white face. There are so many reasons not to, she managed a sad chuckle, 3,000 of them if we had time to count. Her gaze flicked down to his waistband then back to his face, and not one good reason to do it. But you need to make the trade. You should save Ophelia. And now her expression was wry, but there was warning and something more in her gaze. The fly can't escape the trap. You might as well save one. She speaks truth, Lord Henry said amused. Unusual for a witch. Her hand seemed to touch him, but instead she did something to the weapon she'd given him, the small click lost in the booming sound of the Specters' gloating laugh. She squeezed his hand one last time, then dragged her hand free from his clasp, from his hand that wanted to cling, to hold on to her and never let her go. He stopped. What could he say? He nodded, to let her know he'd received her message. It's all right. She leaned in to press her lips to his cheek, whispered in his ear, when I reach the top of the ramp. She turned from him to face the specter, ignoring the human Lord Henry. She leaned her long gun against the railing and straightened her shoulders. Send her down. The cane head pointed at Ophelia again, the red rope falling away. Ernest, she said, starting toward him with her arms out, remnants of flesh hanging from the bones. All he felt was horror and dread. The dark maw of her mouth, the merciless gaze. The red eyes. He fingered the weapon. He had good aim, even under duress, but never had he needed accuracy so desperately. He did not expect the apparently human Lord Henry to give him more than a shot or two at the Blizzblighter 3000. Was this why it had felt right to place it up there? Or was he about to get it wrong again? A shadow moved across the base of the airship. The last dragon, he realized. It would attack too, most likely. In any case, he'd rather reset time and do this again, than live his life with that travesty of Ophelia. Prudence didn't rush toward her fate. One didn't. Not if one had even a smidgen of survival instinct. In fact, it took all her resolution to step onto that semi-transparent gangplank. She lifted a booted foot and tested it. It held without feeling solid. She glanced across, met her grandfather's gaze, saw his slight nod. If his free will hadn't been completely subdued, it was a good sign she'd made the right call. Funny how that didn't help all that much. And she didn't know if his free will had survived. He might be part of the trap. Maybe they didn't care if the fly came willingly. Prudence brought her other foot onto the gangplank. She seemed to sink in an inch or so. She tried to lift her foot, which shifted her weight back, and the misty goop tightened around her feet. She couldn't move until she leaned forward, could only go forward, she realized. She leaned forward and was able to take a couple of steps, each time sinking deeper into the goo. Hopefully, she wouldn't sink so deep she'd fall out the other side. It was a long drop. Ophelia didn't rush either. She sashayed, which was not pretty since she was mostly skeletal. The remnant of her lips curved in triumph, her gaze dismissed Prudence, though Prudence wasn't sure if the dismissal was as a woman or as a threat. If the gal had had access to a mirror, she might not be quite so confident. Because Prudence was a woman and Ophelia was only sort of a woman, Prudence arched her brows, returned the dismissive look, then rolled her eyes. Ophelia's hands curled into claws and she made a move toward Prudence, but a blast of cold air seemed to push her down the ramp. They passed each other, holy cow the smell, without contact. And weirdly enough, Prudence began to slide up the gangplank without any effort on her part. Like she was on a conveyor belt now, moving toward her nasty fate. She looked down, trying to see if there was a mechanism of some sort. That's when she saw the fog creeping up the sides of the airship, and then across the gangplank toward her. The flight instinct surged as the white mist crept closer. It took all her willpower to hold the portal at bay. Like icy fingers, the fog wrapped first one ankle, then the other, then it began to wind up both legs. At first it was so cold it ached, a cold burn even through the boots. She thought she heard a soft clink, and felt the additional chill of metal against bare skin, sinking into her bones. Now panic clawed at her throat. A scream tried to push out. She wouldn't let it, though she choked on it. She felt Octavius's panic. Below her, she saw the dragon circling the water, shooting flames at the surface as if daring him to come out. She couldn't help him. Couldn't help herself. If Ernest, even if he hit the mark, would it work? Just because the fly didn't struggle, didn't mean it wasn't trapped. That it could escape. Her hands fisted at her sides as the fog tightened its grip. The burn was just short of intolerable. She shuddered to hold in the moan. Around her the specters moaned for her, some with pleasure, others in what appeared to be shared pain. And she drew inexorably closer and closer to the Lord Henry Spectre. Like his human counterpart, a tongue snaked out, licking the remnants of lips. The closer she got, the worse the stench. That's what she smelled, to a lesser degree when close to the human version, she realized. What did that mean? Was a part of him still dead? The eyes, the other specters behind those eyes, were clustered on the deck, a well-defined gap between them and Spectre Lord Henry. The Lord Henry Spectre smiled, the teeth in his visible skull parting in a rictus grin. He lifted the cane head, moving it in a circle that wrapped her in the red ropes that burned a new way, and turned her like a puppet. At his side but facing the lighthouse. Facing Ernest and the avid human Lord Henry. A hand, more bone than flesh, stroked her hair and cheek, and this time a moan escaped her lips. Despair crept toward her heart, its fingers as icy cold as the spectre's touch. So warm, the spectre purred, leaning close and inhaling, the action and words echoed by the human Lord Henry. His tongue snaked around his mouth again, and the remnants of lips curved up. So sweet. And all mine. I look forward to introducing you to my ship. Her stomach roiled, but oddly enough, that wasn't the worst pain she felt. They wanted her to see Ernest and Ophelia. They wanted Ernest to see her. They wanted both of them to lose all hope. That was the power of the lighthouse. Hope. A faint flicker of it pulsed in her heart. Spectre Lord Henry and human Lord Henry lifted their cane heads, directing red light at Ophelia. It struck her like a blow that made her scream, but then flesh and skin flowed in a slow wave up from her feet and across her body. She gasped as her lungs breathed again, her shoulders rising and falling. Her hair, the tatters of blonde, turned into a liquid gold flow. Prudence couldn't see her face. She could see Ernest's. His eyes widened with shock, and it seemed his hand slackened on the trigger of the weapon that his hand hid from them. Ernest. The voice was Ophelia's, richly caressing, filled with charm. My dearest love. Prudence felt that hope flicker waver, and the chains tightened so that she couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. Darkness began to close in. The ramp turned into a long tunnel, with Ernest at the end, and the golden Ophelia moving to block her view of him. And to block his view of Prudence. I've missed you so much. Ernest could not believe what he saw. It was Ophelia, one better than his poor memory. How could he have forgotten her? Had he really thought he was over her? She was perfect. She was real, so real, he only had to reach out and draw her into his empty arms. So real. He drew in an unsteady breath. Would he have forgotten this perfection? It was not easy when his thoughts and feelings were clouded with hope and fear, but he tried to match this reality to memory. And as he did, Lord Henry's words came back to mock him. I am better than before. Too real. Too good to be true. Relief swept through him as his mind cleared. His gaze shifted to Prudence, slowly disappearing into the circling fog. A fog wrapping her in chains, he realized with horror as the fog shifted, exposing legs beginning to fade like the other specters. The spectre Lord Henry stroked her cheek, his eyes gleaming with perverse possessiveness. She's mine now, he said, his mouth forming words that came out of the human Lord Henry's mouth. In one frantic motion, he pulled the weapon she'd given him, and pointed it at the shadow that was his Blizablighter 3000 up in the ceiling's peak, pointed it at the meteorite, hoping against the overwhelming despair that he wasn't too late. The pure white light struck the meteorite, or seemed to. He fired again. And again. He heard the sounds of a struggle below, and looked down. Saw Niles and Crispin fighting Winston and Fred in the stairwell. Niles ripped Winston's head off and tossed it aside, then tossed the headless body down the stairwell too. He looked up and started up the stairs, his arms out. Crispin and Fred appeared to be more evenly matched. He had no time to watch or help him, as Lord Henry closed on his other side. Ernest fired at Lord Henry, then fired again. Light danced across the surface of his body, giving glimpses of bone and a difference engine brain inside his skull. Overhead, the meteorite flared with gold and white light, veins in the stone picking up that light and carrying it up the wires he'd attached to the lightning rod. The light flashed around the lamp room as well. But most of the energy appeared to surge in a series of masses, back along the lightning toward the ghost ship. One of the flashes inside the room struck Lord Henry, lighting him up again. His body shuddered, and he shrieked with rage as his human shell began to disintegrate, the pieces rising and spinning as if they'd been picked up by a small cyclone. With a final surge of energy, fire and smoke consumed him in a bright red flash. The specter Lord Henry shrieked in rage as the bright white light continued to build out from the lighthouse, sending more and more masses of light along the connected lightning flashes and back to the airship, hitting it like multiple cannon shots. Ophelia screamed as one of the masses of light hit her, and she vanished in a ball of white and red. More and more of the light balls slammed into the sides of the airship, punching holes that quickly expanded, as if acid ate at it. Blue sky showed through the holes as the storm began to dissipate too. He caught a glimpse of the morning sun rising in the east. A massive ball of light, bigger than the rest, surged up the gangplank toward Prudence and the specter Lord Henry, whose mouth gaped in an unearthly howl of fury. He tried to hold on to Prudence, but his arms turned to dust and got caught in a small whirlwind that spun the dust away from her. As the light ate away the ship, the eyes winked out, like stars vanishing with the rising sun. More light pierced the darkness, the rays of the sun shooting across the water, joining with the last light from the Fresnel and the storm. Ernest saw the gangplank beginning to erode away from the lighthouse. In mere seconds, Prudence would be stranded over nothing. No. He started toward her, but there was no way to reach her. The last bit of the specter Lord Henry laughed, the sound choking off as his head turned to dust, and then the airship, all of it including the gangplank, vanished. Prudence seemed to hang in the air for a second. He gripped the railing, his hand out as she started to fall. Out of a low cloud, the dragon screamed towards her, his wings back, his mouth open wide. The sea boiled to life, multiple arms reaching out and grabbing it in mid-flight, pulling it down into the water. Steam rose briefly from the spot where, a few seconds later, Prudence hit the surface and sank out of sight. As if releasing one last act of malice, a shockwave hit Ernest, throwing him backwards into the lighthouse. You've been listening to Specters in the Storm by Pauline Baird Jones. Copyright by Pauline Baird Jones. All rights reserved.